Good to be with you all this morning. I'm not a pastor who usually preaches here, so I thought I'd provide just a little bit of context that might be helpful. I think we're a fairly close-knit community, but it is impossible for all of us to know everyone's story. And so I'm going to be reflecting a little bit on my time here at Silverwood, and just thought I'd give a little bit of context around that. It was about a little over 12 years ago that I started coming to Silverwood, and I started as coming because I was on the pastoral staff here, and I was the youth minister here. And then I did that for almost 5 years, and then my wife Kelly and I went and served with Mennonite Mission Network in Columbia for 3 years. And then when we moved back to the area, started coming here again. And currently I'm the chairperson for the board, and was asked to preach today. And I believe the last time I preached here at Silverwood, my wife Kelly was pregnant with our now son Freddie, and it served as a good opportunity to inform the congregation that we were pregnant then. And so this time, if you haven't seen my wife, I just thought I would let you know that we are, if you had a suspicion, we are pregnant again. But something went haywire, and it's twins. And so that means there's two of them. And so, we've been trying to figure out what this means for our lives. And so the amount of children who will be interrupting my sleep, whose diapers we need to change, whose mouths we need to feed, the amount of noise in my house is going to increase by 200% in that math this week. So it's something, I'm trying to wrap my brain around. What does my life look like in the coming months when these two babies arrive? And so we've been making plans and trying to figure out schedules and how we're going to manage. And, that's been going okay, I think. We'll figure, once they come, I'm sure things will be different and we'll adjust. But what perhaps makes me the most nervous, what kind of keeps me up at night, is not what my household will look like in the coming months and years. But what really keeps me up at night is what will our world look like in the coming months and years. What is the kind of world that I'm bringing these kids into? So I think it was in June, I was at work, I was at my office, and I was checking the news. And I started reading the articles around, the war in Gaza, the election that was coming up, assassination attempts, conflicts going on around the world. And I kind of just ended up doom scrolling my way through my afternoon, right? So I finally packed up my things and I walked out of the office, feeling a huge sense of despair, slight panic. What's the future going to look like? And I opened the door to walk out of my office, and I said out loud under my breath, how do we make it through? In the text that was read, we encounter a woman in a much more dire situation than I'm in. A widow with a son in a time when being a widow meant social and economic tragedy. In that culture, a death of a husband usually meant a type of cultural death for the woman as well. To denote her change in status, she would have wore different clothes. And if she didn't have any inheritance, she was kind of in no man's land. She had left her own family to join her husband's family. And with her husband gone, the relationship maybe was tenuous at best. Furthermore, she had no able-bodied children to help her work her husband's land. Then she had no means of accumulating any kind of money. On top of that, there's a famine happening. and she is down to her last bits of ingredients for bread. Her plan is to make her last bit of bread, a little flour, a little oil, and then probably die. She's already succumbed to the inevitable answer to the question, how do we make it through? We don't. As I opened the door to my office and said under my breath, how do we make it through? At that moment, I looked up and a blue van drove by. Big letters on the side of it that said, Church, Plumbing and Heating. And I remember thinking, well, that is an answer. I suppose church can be the answer to how we make it through. But it felt a little Sunday school, a little too easy, maybe. However, as I've thought about it, as I've wrestled with this passage, I'm a little more convinced that kind of is indeed the answer to how we make it through. In the text, the widow of Zarephath is visited by the prophet of God, Elijah, who's been hanging out before this in the desert. Why is he hanging out there? Well, because he's made King Ahab and Queen Jezebel pretty angry with some of the words he's been saying. So he's on the run a bit. He's been mostly critical of Queen Jezebel, the foreign woman who married King Ahab and who has introduced her own gods into the Israelite culture. And Elijah has been railing against that. But this passage starts off in an interesting way that we probably missed. It starts off by saying, Then the word of the Lord came to him, Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon, and stay there. So Elijah is to go to this region of Sidon. And here's the thing. Where is Jezebel, Elijah's sworn enemy, from? She's from Sidon. So Elijah is forced into this situation into where his well-being is now dependent on the goodwill from his enemies. The story almost goes out of its way to point out that the scapegoating of another nation or foreigners are enemies or those who we often give the role of other. We can't scapegoat them. We can't make it their fault. That's not actually the way of God. Rather, it is God's logic, which is enduring logic, the real logic that we all eventually arrive at, is that we are all bound together. As our dean pointed out earlier in the Apache way, that we are all brothers and sisters. There is no us and them, there is only us. The well-being of my place is wrapped up in the well-being of my neighbors and even my enemies. When we put away our prejudices and bias, when we make ourselves vulnerable by allowing others to enter into our space, and as we enter into other spaces, it turns out there is indeed enough. In the story, the oil and flour never run out. And for us too, within God's logic, when we come together and open ourselves up to the logic of God, we too find there are answers to the question, how do we make it through? By opening up herself to Elijah, the widow saves herself and her son. By opening up himself to the widow, Elijah saves the widow and he saves himself. In the logic of our day, which has us look out for ourselves first and foremost, this does not make much sense. But we see in this story, and perhaps in the microcosm of our own community here, that as we lean into the logic of God together, there is always enough, there is always more than enough. We don't really have to look further than our own potlucks to see this, right? To see how the small contributions of the many make for an abundance for all. Our theme this year is hurting, healing, and growing. Elijah, who is likely experiencing the pain of being a wanted man speaking up about his faith. Chased from his homeland, he has been dependent on the ravens for food in this passage. In the passage before this one that was read. He is likely experiencing his own hurt. Indeed, the hurt of a single widowed mother who is down to her last food supplies and is expecting to die is pretty apparent. We know that in the usual formula that plays out in our world, hurt people hurt people. However, as this story plays out in God's logic, hurt people are healed and transformed and released to grow. It's dangerous to get a bunch of hurt people together. Often, anger is the easiest of emotions. And so we can take our pain and we can combine it together and turn our rage towards a scapegoat that we think holds the key to our pain. And certainly there are times for a holy rage against systems of oppression and injustice. But to allow hurt to have the final say in our lives and situation is the cause of so much violence and problems already in our world. And so the remarkable thing about this passage and about the stories throughout the Bible is that we are constantly seeing hurt people being placed together. And instead of their hurt turning into violence and hatred, they are transformed by God's logic of love. Where we are shown over and over that love is not a finite resource where there's only so much to go around, or a zero-sum game where the love that I receive takes away from the love available to others, or vice versa. Rather, that love never runs out. Love never fails. When love is given the opportunity, it always transforms, it always makes a way through. And this is where I think church is a valid answer to the question of how do we make it through. Whatever this world turns out to be, a group of hurt people who choose love over hatred, who choose God's logic of interdependence as opposed to the world's logic of individualism. A group of people who choose to keep healing and to keep growing will always serve as an alternative to whatever comes our way. It will always result in abundance. In addition, I think church is an answer to how we make it through, as it reminds us of the larger reality that is going on. One that is not based on the results of an election or the outcomes of a conflict, but rather on the reality that God is reconciling all things. A few weeks ago and today, we're doing these congregational review meetings. If you missed the first, you have a chance today at 4 o'clock to gather around and discuss some of the topics that we have centered our congregation around in the Becoming 2027 statement. The board and pastors thought this would be a good way to gather some feedback in order to assess where we are at as a congregation regarding these areas and to give us an idea of what is it that we are doing really good at, and maybe what are some ways in which we could be growing even more. And I think it's been providing that feedback that we've been asking for. However, in my experience in the first round of doing this, these discussions did not just elicit content for feedback, but rather we heard our stories. Stories of how we have hurt together, of how we have healed together, and how we have grown together. We are broken people who carry pain and hurt from all manner of things that we have experienced. But in the stories that I've heard from many of you, and I've experienced here myself in this congregation, we have said that hurt is not a scarlet letter that needs to be left at the door, but that we welcome that hurt into this congregation knowing it is part of people's lives. And so when we hurt together. We have said we are authentic and vulnerable in our relationships and in our struggles together. That's part of our 2027 statement. We have welcomed the pain that people have brought with them, recognizing that pain is often our best teacher, and that underneath pain is the opportunity for healing and growth. When I started at Silverwood 12 years ago, we were hosting grief share groups, and in the time since, we've hosted Ryan's Place, a grief counseling organization. We've recently started support groups for those experiencing miscarriage and pregnancy loss. We have shared open and vulnerably in our Sunday schools, in our small groups, in our dinner groups about our struggles. We have grieved together over the loss of family members through diagnoses. We have shared the load of carrying each other's burdens. And this has been a place for many of us in which that pain has been met with a listening ear, open arms, meal trains, emotional, and even financial support. And ultimately, with a way through. Silverwood is a place where it is okay to hurt. By being a place where our hurts are welcomed and cared for, they are transformed into healing. And so as I listened to the stories in our congregational meeting, I also noted the stories of healing. For some of us, our hurt actually comes from the church itself. I noted that this has been a place where wounds from past unfortunate church experiences can be healed. By just having the space where this can be recognized, it opens up the door for transformation. It allows us to recognize ourselves as the beloved of God and live into who God says we are, as opposed to maybe perhaps the messages that we have received about ourselves from past churches or pastors who maybe hadn't dealt with their own hurts and lived into the common formula of hurt people hurting people. Silverwood is a place where healing happens. As we have been authentic with our hurts and we have been liberated and healed, we have been unleashed and then liberated to heal others, and it has allowed us to grow. This is not the same congregation as it was 12 years ago when I started here. And I don't mean that just the people are different, although many of you have come within that 12-year time period. But that we as a group are different. What's most remarkable to me about this congregation is that it is a congregation that grows together. We don't always agree on everything, but for the most part, I think we have an understanding that we also don't always expect to be right about everything. And so it creates an atmosphere where we are willing to learn and move together into new places. In so many ways, in my experience, curiosity has won out over fear in this congregation. And so Silverwood has been a place where we grow together. In the congregational meeting, the first question that's asked is, why do you attend Silverwood? My answer to that question is, well, originally I attended Silverwood because you all paid me to be here. And after my time as pastor here, Kelly and I, when we moved to Columbia, we didn't really know if we were ever going to come back here again. We didn't know if we would be back in this area. And so, but however, it was in Columbia, actually, while we were away from this congregation, that in some ways I felt the most a part of this congregation. This congregation cared and carried us through significant hurts and challenges, helping us to heal and grow. When we came back to the area, it felt like no decision had to be made where we would go. We wanted to be with our family, with people who we have hurt with, who we have healed with, and who we have grown with. Church, this church, has been our way through in the past. And I anticipate that whatever the future brings, it will continue to help us make a way through, especially with twins. If you hear me say anything, we're going to make up. I recognize, though, this is my story here at Silverwood, that not everyone's story is the same. I recognize that we are not perfect here. There's still a lot of work to be done. However, I do think that in some pretty significant ways, we have turned ourselves towards the logic of God that says there is always a way through, and that way is love. There is always enough in the economy of God. There's a story that I heard a few years ago on NPR that I continue to think about as I think about the church today. I'm sure I'll butcher this story, but it goes something like this, that back in the days, way back when things like buckets could talk, a boy took his trusty old bucket down to the river each day to gather water. And as his bucket became older and older, it started to leak water through the cracks that had formed over time. Finally, one day, as the boy was walking with his bucket to the river, the bucket said to the boy, "You know, why don't you just get rid of me? I no longer serve the purpose of holding water well from the river to your home like I used to. I'm old and I'm worn out. There was once a time that maybe I did this well, but no longer." The boy replied to the bucket, "Look around on the path to this river. All along the path there's wildflowers that have grown." The boy said, "You are right that you no longer hold water like you used to, and you leak on the way to and from the river each day, but because you leak, you water the ground around the path so that wildflowers grow where they could not otherwise. You are right that you are leaky and broken, but still I think I will keep you." In some ways, I think this describes well how God probably thinks about us as we try to follow Jesus and be the church today. We rarely get it completely right. We fail often to do the job we were made to do. We are hurt people who honestly probably hurt people. We are busted and bruised, but God's logic is not dependent so much on us, but rather a true sign of grace is that from a broken earth, flowers come up, pushing through dirt. And so still God's kingdom and God's healing and growing are realized, even in our poor, imperfect efforts. So let us lean in. Let us look for the ways that we can continue to take risks that may appear illogical to our human formulas, knowing that how we make it through is by going forth in love, recognizing that love, like flour and oil in this story, will not run out. May we go forth in grace, knowing that God says to us, like the boy to the bucket, "I think I will keep you." And may we go forth in peace, knowing ultimately that God's logic and love will see us through. Amen.